All right.
All right. Let's make sure we can hear everything okay. Monitor's off. This is on. Just want to make sure everybody can hear everything. Daniel Rios. All right. So we're live on multiple platforms right now. We're live on, let's turn this guy because can't really see anything. Let's see about that. Let's try that. Let's move this here. All right, let's see what happens. So we're live on Instagram. We're live on YouTube. We're live on Facebook. Basically, if you want the most interactive experience, I'll say this periodically throughout, but if you want the most interactive experience, please join us on YouTube. The reason why is we have a whole cam software, so it's in 4K, it looks really good. We can host the questions that come in on the screen through YouTube. We can't do that on the other services. So if you want to have the best experience, you want to hear what Tim Marco is going to be playing, because Tim Marco is right here next to me. If you want to hear what he's playing, then you're going to have to be on the YouTube side. There's no other way around it. I'm sorry. So if you can join us on YouTube, the link is in the description. In our profile on Instagram, the link is actually in the actual video if you are on Facebook. So please be sure to join us there. If you have questions as we're going through this stuff, please feel free to put those in the comments. If you don't have YouTube for some reason, you can still put the questions in the comments on Facebook or Instagram. Mejia is on this side of me, and he will be entering those questions into our YouTube feed so that we can feature them. You just won't get the same full experience. You won't be able to hear Tim. Tim, I'm going to move this way a little bit so that you can come this way. And come kind of like on my same planes, and that way the focus will pick you up. Cool. So we're going to be nice and cozy today. Cozy-ish. All right, cool.
These lights make a big difference.
Yeah, they totally make a difference. We almost were like too blown out on our last live stream. It was like too bright. So today, loosely sponsored by LaCroix. Tim, would you like LaCroix? I have pepino cucumber. I have strawberry, and I have lemon. What would you like, Mejia?
Whatever's left.
We got two choices here. All right. Loosely sponsored by LaCroix. All opening them up. Cheers to everybody out there. Happy Friday.
So fresh.
So we're going to start with just some basic housekeeping. Things I wanted to just let people know. A lot of you have steel string MK2 orders that are out. And for whatever reason, our batch from our contract manufacturer ended up going to Las Vegas for some reason. We got that figured out, so it's all back in the warehouse, and they're actually shipping out stuff right now as we speak. I think the first 800 or so steel strings went like super quick, way faster than we expected, and so it took us a little bit longer to recover from that and get the rest of them out there. So we have, I think, another 350 or so coming in. So that should kind of cover everybody who's outstanding, plus any of our dealerships that are still waiting on them. So thank you for all those who have been patient on that one. We really appreciate that. And if you do want a steel string MK2, we have a whole list of dealers that will be having them. I think we're totally sold out of what we have in stock and store. We might have a couple left, but if you see it saying sold out on our page on the Vertex Effects website, we have a whole list of great dealers from Sweetwater to Sam Ash to lots of independents that are incredible and amazing. So please check those guys out to see if there's one near you. But other than that, I want to kind of get into power supplies. One thing that when we were at Sweetwater a few weeks ago, they were asking us about if we could do some presentations not related to our own products, but rather about best practices with power supplies. How the sales engineers there, because Sweetwater has a team of 450 brilliant sales engineers who are on the phone all day long with customers that ask these very questions. And some of them have a good degree of knowledge on this stuff, but maybe don't know some of the key differentiators, like why would you want to pay $250 for a power supply as opposed to $150? And what are you getting in between? Is it really value that's being added? So we're going to be talking about that. We also have some amazing stuff today that Tim's going to be walking us through. We're doing the Battle of the Klons. We have Klon 1 versus Klon 2 versus some clones. We got the Archer. So we're going to be comparing those. We also have 2 vintage tube screamers. We have an original from 79 that we're going to be comparing to the 808. Tim, can you grab that? Or the 10 rather. The Japanese TS10. So we're going to have a plethora of shootouts that we're going to be doing today with some other overdrives kind of at the end. We're going to be running these on power supply, not on battery, but we're going to talk a little bit about those differences and why you might want to check out power supply versus battery. So first, let's just get the lay of the land with power supplies. There's so many different kinds out there. We're going to start with the traditional, the one that everybody knows, the one that everybody loves, the classic Voodoo Lab pedal power. Now, this is a 4x4. If you're not familiar with this one, I mean, I can bring it up on the screen here for you. This is the 4x4 classic one everybody knows and loves. I mean, we probably all have you had a pedal power in the past, Tim? We certainly never had one.
I've used them though.
You've used them. Do you like backline a power supply?
Oh, well, I mean, my roommate has one, so I've sort of used it for like a show.
Okay, got it. Mahia, pedal power. Have you ever had one?
Never had one.
Well, if you're older than 30 like me, this was your only option for many years, was having a pedal power too. And this is what's called a linear analog supply. So these are 100% analog. They use toroidal transformers in order to provide the isolated power that we all know and love, and you always see that. Toroid is just a transformer that's in there, and the toroid is kind of just like the shape of the transformer, the type of transformer that it is, that allows each one of these outputs to be isolated, has regulators that go through each one of these. This is what the majority of us know as an isolated power supply, kind of the original isolated power supply. Now, on these guys, they were great. They were cutting edge for many years. But something that was in the pro audio side for years and years that is just kind of starting to make its way into the power supply world of guitar pedals is what's called a switching supply. And switching supply would be examples like this Cioks DC7, which is a great supply. Also the Strymon Zuma, aka Zumba, for those of you who are dance inclined. And then there's also one other one. Tim, can you grab me that one that's hooked in? We might just have to be gentle with it or just unplug it for a second from the... There we go. And we also have the CS12, which we're going to use to power some pedals today, which is by Truetone. So what these all have in common is that they are switching power supplies. Now, what that means is that it's using a different technique to get the isolation. And this technique is much more efficient than what the toroidal transformer would be, the analog supply version. Now, just because this is not analog and it's using high frequency, and it's using basically a high frequency oscillator going into these miniature little transformers that are way more efficient, take way less power, way smaller, and then kind of pushing that out to all of the individual outputs. So what that's doing is allowing you to have something that weighs way less, is in a way smaller form factor. Because if you compare, this is 1 inch versus something that's almost double the size of it in terms of the height in the pedal power. So it's doing it in a way smaller package. It's way lighter, way more efficient, and you can get a lot more power out of it. So like this can put out, I think it's 660 milliamps per, versus this one has a couple that can do 400, but even like weight-wise, I know you can't feel it over the internet, but it's a significantly heavier supply on this side, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. So most would agree that the switching power supplies are kind of the wave of the future. They're lighter, more efficient, put out more power, are typically can be quieter. The reason why I say that is when you have a transformer, even if it's a toroidal transformer, which is kind of the best at rejecting any sort of introducing any sort of noise into the signal, it kind of is the best at rejecting that. These guys are pretty impervious to even putting pedals right on top of the power supply. So a lot of times in the toroidal stuff, you can put stuff near it, but sometimes if you put digital things right on top of the toroid power supply, especially on stuff like this, where there's no there is some electrostatic shielding on this one because it's out of aluminum, but typically you're not going to get any electromagnetic shielding because this is aluminum. So the toroidal transformer, the magnetic field, can get into stuff. It can cause there to be some weird issues if you put stuff right on top of it, depending on where the field is, and that can be a problem. But when you're into the switching supplies like this, you're not going to have that problem. You can put pedals right on top of it. It's not going to be an issue. So a lot of times if we use like a pedal power and we use a pedal train, our pedals are sitting right on top of the pedal power. If we're using like kind of the old school like this can cause a problem if you're putting certain pedals on top of it, digital stuff that has clocks. Sometimes it can get into the signal path and make some weird noise. This won't be a problem when you're using the Cioks. It won't be a problem if you're using the Zuma. It wouldn't be a problem if you're using the CS12. Those are all switching supplies, way less sensitive to that sort of stuff. Again, much higher power that they offer for the size that they are. And some of these are incredibly well built and incredibly robust. On my personal rig, I'm going to be using the DC7 because I really like these. The one thing that's a little different is they use RCA plugs, which is different than the standard kind of like 2.1 millimeter barrel, standard stuff that you would see on a Voodoo Lab or some of the other ones. They look this way on the pedal end, but on the supply end, they use RCA cables. But that's actually a better, more reliable connection than the 2.1 millimeter standard that most of the power supplies have used. Just has a better connection overall. But in any case, those are some key differences. What I would say is if you're trying to get entry level on a budget, you want to get a really inexpensive power supply that's a really great one, I think the obvious choice is the Truetone. This is the one that's kind of hanging out over here. This is obviously the big dog, has 12 outputs, but they make a smaller one called the CS6 and the CS7. Those are great for the money, really, really effective, really, really quiet, totally switching, so it's got kind of the new wave of things as far as power supplies are concerned. It's not the old analog toroidal style transformer. This is new style power supply, really quiet, really efficient, pretty lightweight, pretty robust. It's built in a very similar form factor to the Pedal Power 2. It's a little bit bigger, but it does offer much more options in terms of the amount of outputs. So this is a consideration. Again, there's a smaller one that's maybe about a third of this size called the CS7, and then there's also the CS6, which is like a really short, thin profile like the DC7. Those are all really good options. Tim, if you would please. And then, of course, the Cioks also, great value, really, really high quality power supply, also in that kind of same range, like kind of the low to mid $100 range. And then if you really wanted to splurge and go all out, you could go with something like the Strymon Zuma. I think these are about $250. These all have 500 milliamp outputs for every single output. And then it has two that on the end here, which you can go between 18 and 12 volts, in addition to 9 volts, so you can have some voltage variations in there as well. Now, one thing that I will say that is important to know about, though, is that not every pedal obviously will work at this voltage. You can, of course, from Voodoo Labs, they sell really, really high quality adapters. So you can get the current doubler, which is something that you can use if you, say, don't have enough juice to make up the amount of current needed. So if you had something like a Line 6 HX Stomp or something like that, you could use those, double the current. So out of the Strymon, say, you get 2 of those 500 milliamp outputs. You would get, put those together with the current doubler, and then it would get you to 1 amp, which would be enough to power something like those Line 6 ones. Or if you have something that's, say, like a Memory Man that takes 24 volts, you could set those 2 variable voltage ones on the Zuma here at the end. You could set these guys both to 12 volts, and then you would go and use one of the voltage doublers like this from Voodoo Lab, and that would get you to the full 24 volts. Equally, it could give you 18 volts if you didn't have enough 18 volt outputs on your power supply in order to get there. Voodoo Lab makes these, Truetone makes these. Truetone and Voodoo Lab also make a series of adapters for reverse polarity and stuff like that. So things like this that you would hook onto your ordinary 2.1 millimeter connectors. They also make ones that are going from a 2.1 to a 2.5 millimeter like this, and I don't actually know if this is the one that does that or if this is the reverse polarity. Each company has their own colors, but they're usually pretty labeled or pretty well labeled, so you can know which one goes to what kind of corresponding pedal, if that's going for a reverse polarity, if that's going for a 2.1 to a 2.5 millimeter, like the Eventide stuff might be like an H9 is a 2.5 millimeter barrel on the input there. So lots of different options there. Another thing that we've been asked about a lot lately, let me take a drink because I feel like I'm running out of steam, is we got our battery power supply. Tim, you mind grabbing that one for me? Battery power supply. Now, we don't make this anymore, but a lot of people have been asking about this as a power supply alternative. And basically what this is, and I'll show you a little picture of it while I'm opening it up, is inside it just has 4 dedicated 9-volt batteries. And there's also, next to the LED, a power supply input. And what that power supply input does is it basically feeds into this, lets the pedals or the batteries know that the pedal board is turned on. So it will feed the batteries to the pedals when the pedal board is on. And when you unplug it, it just shuts everything off. So you don't have any need to unplug pedals like you normally would, so they wouldn't drain a battery. So it's kind of a cool way of being able to integrate batteries into your system and get all the isolation, because this is truly the quietest that you can get when you're using pedals on batteries. But of course, not all pedals will accept batteries. So that's one thing just to be aware of when you're going and you're having certain pedals run off a battery. The only things I really recommend using this guy on is overdrives, distortions, fuzz, wah. Other pedals won't benefit from using batteries on them, but there can be a different sound, especially if you're using carbon batteries. I think one of these is going off. I don't know whose it is. I think the volume is on the right side. So yeah, this is a good solution if you want to have kind of the tone of a carbon battery, kind of on vintage fuzzes, vintage wahs, ODs, stuff like that. We're not using it today because we were trying to go to a dollar store that was nearby, and I guess it was closed because that's one of the easiest places to get 9-volt carbon batteries. Oh, you know what? It's coming through. It's coming through the headphones. So anyway, very cool solution that you can get if you want to kind of have that tone. And we actually did a demo with Tim. Would you say that was about a year ago, maybe, or a little over a year ago? Mm-hmm. We did a demo where we went side by side through a lot of common pedals like tube screamers, Vox wahs, fuzz faces, things like that, so you could hear what the difference was between powering it off of a battery versus powering off of supply. And again, not all pedals are going to be sensitive to carbon batteries, but older vintage style drives, wahs, fuzzes, those are all going to be pretty sensitive to that type of sound. So just a heads up on this. You can definitely check that out on our YouTube channel. I think the video is called something like what's the best isolated power supply, and we talk about other power supplies, and that's just kind of one of the things that we go over. But before we start getting into some of these questions, let's have Mr. Tim Markinet play a little bit. Let's start with the TS10. We're going to start with the TS10. Now this one's got a little bit of a funky FET in it, so we have to kind of trigger it a few times to get it to gonna go. Oh, we unplugged it. There you go. Plug that one back in. Into the 9-volt one. There we go. So Japanese era, TS10. This is my favorite of all the tube screamer varieties, but not everybody agrees with me. So here you go, Tim. You'll want to hear it. All TS10.
Yeah.
Let's go to like the Stevie Ray setting where like the level's cranked, the tone is cranked, and then the gain is kind of off. Cool. All right, let's get into some questions here. We got, looks like a good amount. Where should we start here, Mejia?
I've taken a look at some of the Instagram ones, not these ones.
All right. All right. Let's go to Rodolfo. I have a Voodoo Lab ISO 5, very good one. I use a few pedals. Yeah, that one's fine. That's definitely more of this style, the analog, linear power supply. It's kind of, I think that this one, in fact, is like half ISO 5 and half of the pedal power 2, or some variation of that. I don't remember all the model distinctions between Voodoo Lab, but it's a totally good one. And if you're not going out of the country, that's one thing I should mention, is that with all these switching supplies, you can use them anywhere in the world. If you just plug them in, they auto-sense the input voltage and automatically recalibrate to whatever that input voltage is so that everything gets the appropriate voltage on the output of this. So that's one cool thing, especially if you're a gigging musician and you need to be able to, use the same power supply without having to uproot it with every country you go to, or having to use a step-up or step-down transformer depending on what country you're in. So that's a cool thing. Hello and big thanks from Belgium. Thanks for watching today. DC7 is awesome. I agree. I think that they're not comparable. You're saying the Zuma is better. Well, the Zuma has 9 outputs. So 9 outputs. This one has 7 outputs. But you can adjust any of these outputs between 9, 12, 15, and 18 volts. So in some ways, this has more versatility than the Zuma. And then if you combine this with any of its adjunct supplies, I feel like it's pretty excellent. I think cost-wise, they're pretty similar. The Zuma, I've had a few problems with with the function of it, but I think that they're a little bit underbuilt. So usually when I build them, and when I did it at our friends at Bestronics in Chicago, we actually outfitted them with thicker, longer screws, because the PEM nuts in there can accept a lot longer screws, but they use these really, really short, like number 2 or number 4 screws that are pretty thin. So I actually feel like the enclosure of the Zuma is actually a little bit underbuilt and could be more robust, and is not as robust as some of the competitors that it has. It is lightweight, but I think that trade-off for the road could go either way, because I've definitely seen ones where the entire shell has come off underneath a riser, or just the vibration on its own has actually disassembled sections of it, or the IEC in the back, things like that, and there's just stuff rattling inside the enclosure that we've had to remediate after the fact. Let's see. Well, I guess, Ruben, that answered your question. If you have 7 pedals, I think the DC7 is actually probably the way to go. Hunter George says, don't take questions from Instagram or Facebook. Well, we don't want to alienate people just because they're not on YouTube. So we'll do our best to accommodate whoever. Let's see. What's IHOP? Do you know what that means? Is that a pancake thing?
Like International House of Pancakes.
International House of Pancakes, best pedalboard or best power for pedalboard. I mean, any of these would work well if you got a gig at IHOP, I think. But whether you have a gig there or not, I think that they're all great. It sort of depends on the number of pedals that you have. If you just want a single supply, if you're only here in the U.S., you're keeping your stuff away from the main issue that I would say with going this route, and these are great supplies and where the industry standard for a long time, is you just have to be careful of where you put things. And if you get stuff too near it, it can be a problem. If you're able to kind of work around this or isolate this in a corner, it may not be such an issue. You may not have any problem at all. But if you want to have the flexibility of being able to power all these big Strymon things and all that, one of the switching supplies is probably going to be preferable for you. What do you think of the Moore power supplies? I haven't tried them, so I can't speak to them. I know that they're inexpensive, but I don't know how the quality fares. This is a question from Instagram. What's the difference between a $50 Donner power supply versus a $250 Zuma? I don't know about the Donner power supply. I mean, typically you get what you pay for on some of this stuff. The Strymons are very, the design of them are great. As I mentioned, there's some things in terms of the robustness that I wish were a little bit better. But I think electrically they're pretty unbeatable, and they're very quiet. I don't know if the Donner is comparable. I would guess that it wouldn't be. If it's $50, there's only so many ways that you can get a power supply to be $50. It may not be isolated. I don't know if it is. But I would imagine that there's going to be some differences there. Another question from Instagram is it bad for sound noise if I daisy chain my pedals? Good question. This is something that a lot of people get confused about. So what a daisy chain is, and I've actually built one here that I use for testing purposes. So basically you can see, let's see at the focus there, there's one jack, and then out of it comes 3 individual cables. So this is okay in certain circumstances. If you have an overdrive or distortion pedals or something that's really low current that doesn't draw a lot, it's totally fine to do that. It's totally fine to put parallel things like that. You just need to test it in advance, make sure that there's not a problem in doing that. Because if you try to parallel it with stuff that's, say, not analog, stuff that is, sorry, my wife is trying to call me. We'll send her a text and remind her about the live stream. We are live streaming. All right. Hopefully that helps us. Sorry, sweetheart. So daisy chaining doesn't necessarily need to be bad. It can be useful in some places. I don't usually recommend trying to go more than 2, 3 at max if you really have to push it. But as long as you're underneath whatever the current limitations are, so let's say it's 100 milliamp output and you're not exceeding that 100 milliamps with the 3 pedals that you've put in there, the 2 pedals you put in there, they're analog, they're distortion, overdrive type pedals, that's typically not going to cause a problem. It tends to be more of a problem if you're mixing digital and analog or stuff with clocks like phasers or flangers and stuff like that. That's usually when you run into problems if you're going to daisy chain. But I would say avoid it if you can. If you can't, try to keep it to 2 per. Don't go over that if you can help it. But testing it's always a good way that's pretty surefire to make sure that there's not going to be an issue. Daniel Rios, hey guys, what's your opinion on a surge protector versus a power supply? Does a power supply have a surge protector? They're different things. Because typically the surge protector is trying to protect the AC that's coming in from the wall. But, a lot of the surge protectors, typically it almost acts like a fuse, I think. When it comes in, when the voltage comes in over a certain threshold, it just shuts the power supply, or shuts the power strip down, which would be feeding, presumably, your power supply. So these are sort of different things. Now, there's like different types of regulators or supplies that can take voltage fluctuations and then regulate it down or up to whatever the voltage level that you've required. I think like Monster has one, and they're pretty expensive, like around $1,000, or I don't know what they go for now. In the old days, they used to be really expensive, but having a surge protector is typically a good thing to have in anything that's expensive audio equipment, just so you don't get a spike in voltage and it fries anything if there isn't any protection built into the device itself for those sorts of issues. But typically they're not thought of as the same thing, at least as far as I'm aware, although I don't design power supplies. So I can't speak to that. I just know a little bit about them, spent a lot of time doing some repairs, doing mods, doing things like that. Talked a lot with guys from Voodoo Lab and other companies that are power supply manufacturers, and know a little bit about the theoretical, especially around the analog linear supplies. But I'm not a power supply designer, so I don't know what kind of protections they put on there, but I would imagine it's not the same. Let's go to another IG. This is Solaris Plexus. At what point do you need 2 power supplies? So as I mentioned to that person who was talking about putting paralleling pedals, so daisy chaining them, you can get away with doing that in a few spaces typically without much of an issue. But if you've maxed out every pedal out of something like a Zuma, and every single thing is daisy chained, you're probably going to get a noise issue at some point. I mean, maybe you can get away with it, but I would be surprised if you can do it repeatedly and not have an issue. So I would say, maybe trying it at a couple of different places, seeing if you have any noise. If you don't, then you're okay. If you start to run out of taps and you have to combine things that are not kind of that analog distortion realm, then if you had a Strymon, maybe you'd get an O-high, which is kind of like their adjunct power supply. If you had a DC7, you might get a DC4, which is like kind of the smaller sister of the DC7, has the DC4, which is about half this size and has 4 outputs. So that would be a condition where you would need to do it. But let's go back to a little bit playing. I'm going to have Tim move on to the 78 original Tube Screamer. You're going to hear a little pop here, which is me unplugging. Cover your ears if you find it offensive. All right, we're going to set everything. Let's set everything at noon. Everything at noon. Do it, Tim. Yeah, do whatever you need. That was the overdrive you turned up.
Yeah, both.
Okay, you went the level. It seems to have less output.
Yeah, it seems kind of quiet, but it sounds really good. And this is all the way up.
So which did you prefer? Did you prefer the Japanese TS10 or did you prefer the 79 TS808?
I don't know, it's hard to say because this one, the drive was kind of low, so it's kind of hard to sort of rock out with it. It's kind of a subtle thickening, but I've been finding with Tube Screamers that I really like to just dime it, and it's pretty fun. This one's nice. It's like kind of squishy. Yeah, it sounds pretty convincing.
Sounds like a Tube Screamer?
I'm convinced.
You're convinced. It's a real Tube Screamer.
Amp-like.
Okay. Yeah, and we're going through a Fender Concert, not the one that's in the back. We have a Fender Concert that's a Paul Revere era, like a 80s. So it has a clean channel and then a dirty channel. We're just using the clean channel, and I think it's either 60 or 40 watt clean channel. And the reverb is also coming from the amp. It's got a spring reverb tank in there. All right, Roberto. If you were to power an HX Stomp, what would you use? Well, I think all of these. I don't think this one can do it. Maybe if you paralleled enough. I guess if you paralleled the 400s and a 100 or two 100s, you'd have to use like that whole side of the power supply to power it. So I wouldn't really recommend using this one for that purpose. The Zuma, if you use that parallel cable, which is the current doubler, this one, if you use the current doubler into this, out of any two of the 9 volts, you'll get 1 amp. So that would power it. So this one would work. Same thing with the DC7. These are 660, or let's see, there's a 660, a 500, so at 9, so 660. So any two of these would also get you that. So if you got the Cioks makes their own version of that cable, you could also do it with this. Equally, Truetone has a couple of other smaller power supplies, and they actually showed some cool videos of how you can combine the power to power those with an HX stomp. I even think they did an HX effects with it as well. So you have a couple of different options. The switching supplies are much more efficient at getting you there because, again, they provide a lot more power for the size, much lower weight, much more efficient, much lighter, and just the whole way that they go about using the high frequency oscillator and then putting that through transformers, little miniature transformers to be able to create the amount of current and voltage needed. They can just do it in a way that the old school analog linear supplies, as good as those were for the time, can just do it a lot better than those can. So any of those would work. So definitely give those a look. Arnaud, big thank you for your DIY topics. What do you think about the DC7? Excellent. As I said, it's a great supply. I really love it. It doesn't have the toroid thing. No, it's a switching power supply. So it's not doing it in the old school linear analog way. Riley Tech, when are the Vertex boards coming out? Our planned release is somewhere around April. I'm building up some right now to take out to Sweetwater. We're going to do some videos of those and hopefully have those out by April. So you'll be able to get them definitely through Sweetwater. So if you have a sales engineer there that you work with, you might want to just give them a heads up to let you know as soon as they're out, because I believe they'll be the first people getting them, to my knowledge. Are Voodoo Lab DC power cables compatible with any power supply? Yes, that's a good question. And I actually prefer the Voodoo Lab ones because they are shielded now. I had a conversation about this with somebody on a video that we did with Sweetwater last week around the shielded cables. And they are shielded, however, where they're shielded on Voodoo Lab cables and most of these cables, it's actually in the wrong place. So they're shielding not around the center conductor. They're just shielding basically where the part that doesn't need to be shielded, or it wouldn't make any difference if it were shielded. But sometimes what I've done in the past is I've actually bought the reverse polarity ones and then just flipped the polarity because the shielding is in the right place on those. But really, for all intents and purposes, you can get away with using the Strymon ones. You can get away with using the Voodoo Lab ones. Whatever your provided power supply cable is probably going to be workable if it's from any of this manufacturers. They've certainly vetted the accessories that they're selling their products with. So you can use those, or if you prefer, I like the feel of the Voodoo Lab ones personally because they're a little bit thinner and they dress a little bit better to me on a pedal board. But I can make any of them work, and I've used all of them. So that is one thing to consider. Let's go one more question, then we're going to get Tim to shred a little bit more. This is Guitars Pedals asks, what is the best placement for a power supply below the board, below some pedals? Well, if it's a linear supply like this guy, you want to keep it kind of away from anything that's digital, away from anything with clocks, just because the magnetic field, this is made out of aluminum, so there is no electromagnetic shielding, which is going to kind of suppress the magnetic field that's created by the transformer. So you want to try to get this away. You want to try to keep pedals away from this as much as possible. There will be pedals that will be less sensitive, and you can actually test this. If you plug this in and you move it around your pedals, you can see if your pedals are powered on and whether there's any sensitivity to the actual transformer in this. They may start making some weird noises, or you'll hear some hum changing. It's something that is a consideration when you are considering where to put this. If you have a switching supply, though, like the Strymon or like the Cioks one that I showed earlier, these are going to have way less susceptibility to that. You can pretty much put anything on top of it and it's not going to be an issue. And if there is, I would probably look at other places other than the power supply being the culprit of the problem, because it would be very rare that the switching supply would be responsible for that noise in terms of pedal proximity and things like that. It would more likely be filtering on the pedal itself that you're plugging into, things like that. Let's get into these clones, man. Let's start with Klon numero uno with the horsey. Sorry for the pop.
The bad horsey Klon.
The bad horsey Klon. It's the collaboration between Morley and and Klon. The Klon Wah. It's time, folks. All right, let's set it the recommended way, because Bill Finnegan always said, gain at the light, treble to taste, output to taste. All right, let's see what we got. We need more?
I think so.
More output?
Well, there's no. So are we sort of?
So this is like kind of the way when you would go in the early days to for the Klons, and you'd go to their show, or you go to a trade show and you'd see them, they would always set the gain at the light, treble to taste, and output to taste. So it's almost more of like a boost when they'd be demoing it at these shows. Here's a little more gain. What you thought?
Cool. Yeah. So it's like.
This is dry. Effect. More gain.
Yeah, it sounds great. It sounds almost like you turned an amp, like a Fender amp up a little bit.
Here, let's try a little bit more gain. Let's see that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Well, and we'll have to compare it to another Klon here, so we can do the side-by-side Klon Centaur experiment. Does every one really sound different? We'll find out.
It's really like throaty.
Yeah.
It's got like this real like it's like there the whole time, you know. Like the Tube Screamer kind of like sags, but that's more beefy.
Yeah. It's got more of that low mid thing.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go to some other ones. We got Steven or Stefan. Let me know if I'm saying that wrong. I love my pedal power until I started using digital effects alongside analog ones. Switch to the Zuma, it's way quieter. Yeah, so this is sometimes an issue that happens. If you get digital pedals too close to the magnetic field, you can have a real issue. So you just need to be aware of that, and it can be mitigated, but it's certainly easier, and you can have a lot less care around your placement if you're using one of the switching supplies like I spoke of. Hunter George, I think he's answering somebody else's question. Okay, let's go to any ones you see that are ready for commentary that I should be aware of. Tough to beat an high 30. It's a great one. Another alternative to that would be the CS6 from Truetone. Also another good one, kind of similar form factor. Any plans on making a reverb pedal? Not at this time. There's plenty of good ones out there. I really like the Digitech Hardwire RV7 or the Boss FRV1 for the spring sound. Those are really great. I put one of those on RJ Ronquillo's board. Really fantastic. Renato NYC. I'm choosing between a CS12 or a Cioks Chocolate. Ciocolate. I need a Power NHX Stomp and about 9 pedals. I think the CS12 is going to be a better long-term solution because it is switching, and the Cioks one, that version is not switching. You'd have to go to like the DC7 and then get a DC4, which is kind of like one of their adjunct auxiliary supplies. Those two would be excellent if you want to go Cioks, and these are really good. And I mean, the profile of these is like, it's tiny. It's like smaller than a bar of soap in terms of the thickness. So I'd say either go CS12 or go with the switching power supplies that Cioks makes, like comparing the CS or the DC7 with the the DC4, and that would work great. Anything on there, Mahir, or should I just keep going?
I think you're good to keep going.
Richard Longacre, have you covered the new Pedal Power 3 Plus yet? Well, I did some interviews with them at NAMM about it, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be out until another month or so. If it's out already, then let me know, and I can plan a trip to go up there and do some videos on it. It looked like it was a really cool supply and was going to be competing with guys like the Zuma. It's just that Voodoo Lab's been a few years late to the table, so there's been a few advancements that have kind of happened as they've kind of been putting stuff together. I have no doubt it'll be an excellent power supply. Voodoo Lab does really, really great stuff, and I'm sure that you'll see plenty of Pedal Power 3s on boards that we're doing, as well as many other pros around the world. What's the best volume pedal with the least tone suck? Well, I'd say the best built is the Lely ones. They have a buffer in it that helps with that tone suck. The buffer's pretty good in there. For passive ones, I think probably the Dunlop Volume X is really good. But all volume pedals are going to have a tone suck to some degree, especially if they're passive. So, that's why we came out with our Vertex Boost, so it would isolate the impedance of any volume pedal as well as boost. So you can put your volume pedal in there and it basically becomes an expression. And you can also boost with the volume pedal and control that. So check out our Vertex Boost. Also check out the Lely volume pedal. Let's see. Have you tried the Palmer isolated supplies? I haven't tried one yet. No, I haven't tried them. Let's take a couple more and then we'll try another Klon. I'm planning to start with 2 pedals, probably an Avalanche run and Dunes. Should I get a power supply now? No, I don't think so. I don't know if both those take batteries. I think the Dunes one does, because I think that's kind of like their Tube Screamer thing. So you could put a battery in that guy, and I don't know if the Avalanche run takes batteries, but if it doesn't, you could just get a single wall wart for that. You probably don't need the supply yet until you start really getting into some stuff. And then maybe a cheap, easy one to start off with would be like the Truetone CS6 is really reasonable. You get 6 outputs, all isolated, switching power supplies, so kind of the newest style power, really clean, really lightweight, and really powerful. So that might be a good place to start. Or you could start with something like the Cioks DC4, which is another small one. Let's do one more, and then we'll go to some more playing. This is Mitchell K. Barnett. Could I use the steel string at the end of my board and treat it pretty much like an amp? You could. If you're going to go direct with it, I don't know that it would be it won't be as accurate as it would sound through a tube amp, because we designed it to go into the front end of a tube amp. But I think it sounds best after other overdrives, so they all kind of get processed through that color of the steel string. But that's how I think it sounds best, and that was kind of the design intent around it, so that's what I would recommend. Let's get into Klon number 2. Tim, if you wouldn't mind unplugging that guy and putting it into the other Klon. All right, let's start at the same position. This is the recommended setting from Bill Finnegan. Go for it. Some people are saying they can't hear sound. I got it. I got it. Bring up the gain. So which one was better?
Ooh, I don't know.
Do they feel pretty close?
This feels like less like more like polished sounding, if that makes any sense. Less like still sort of I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it's just a visual, because this one's actually polished and this one's raw metal. But I feel like that's how they sound. Is this one sounds a little bit more contained, and this one's sort of just like has some edges to the sound of it. It was like maybe.
If you were gonna pick one for yourself, which would you take?
I think this one was really cool sounding.
The horsey one.
Yeah.
A little more raw.
The bad horsey.
The bad horsey, you know, the collab between Bill Finnegan and Morley.
Is there an actual difference though?
I don't know.
Are these originals?
Yeah.
Are they?
Well, I think that one's earlier.
So this is an earlier one. This is like.
This is a more recent one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We'll try the Archer next, so we can see what a clone sounds like in relationship to that. All right. Let's go back to some questions. And Mejia, just chime in at any point if there's stuff that you think we should go to. This is Renato NYC. How about AC versus DC? Some supplies have AC. Yes. So like the CS12 that we were looking at earlier, which is this guy here, that has an AC out. So if you had like a whammy or something like that, you could do that. And on the back, you know, because that part is not part of the switching supply, that actually does have a transformer for that. There is a toggle on the back or a slider that can switch it over to 220 or 120. So when you are going out of the country that one, it won't auto-calibrate that output. You'd have to actually physically switch it. Other than that, I think Cioks has a few that have some AC outputs as well, and options for that. And of course, Pedal Power has the AC version of the Pedal Power for AC pedals. But it seems like that's more uncommon these days than it was 10 years ago when I kind of first started doing rigs and things like that. So we don't really see a lot of those anymore. Let's see. This is one from Instagram. Should the instrument cables and DC cables not be tied down together? This is something that is debatable. My feeling is that we're not dealing with the voltages that require, in the current requirements that would really cause the type of noise that would really be a problem for this. So I think if you can keep them separated, it's a good practice. But if they have to cross at certain points, it's not going to be the end of the world. So I wouldn't rearrange my entire rig if you have DC and your audio cables crossing paths at certain points. It's not going to be the end of the world. I like keeping them separate because it's actually easier for me to route them, because having these huge, wire routing looms where I have DC power and audio, they just become too thick and it's difficult to maneuver them easily. So I usually keep them separate, not just for a functional reason or an aesthetic reason, but also a functional reason in that regard. So just something to keep in mind. TV, do I have to change my power supply when I record? Well, I don't know what your power supply is, but if it's noisy, you could always just go to batteries too. That's the ultimate isolated power supply. Let's see. No, this is not the amp he's playing in the background. We have a Fender Concert that's kind of underneath the table here, and that's going, right now it's not going into any cab. It's actually going into a Mesa Boogie cab clone right now, set to the open back setting, which is kind of like a Mesa Boogie Black Shadow speaker emulation, which is sort of like a classic lead 80, I'd say, from Celestion with a 57 on it. So that's what we're using right now. Have you ever tried the steel string pedal into IRs? Yeah, it sounds great. I mean, as long as the IR is good and kind of representative of what the amp would want. If you were using a Dumble style amp and you were going into a Celestion G1265 IR, it's probably going to sound pretty good because those pairings would be typical. Ivan, I'm planning to get the CS12. How can I power a Diamond Vibrato using that? What cable should I use for the reverse polarity? I don't know the exact tip if it's a 2.5 millimeter, there's going to be one that converts 2.1 to 2.5. And then there's, I think, one variation where it keeps the polarity the same. And then there's another one where it reverses the polarity. So as long as you're aware of what the polarity difference is and that you're certain that it's 2.5, the 2.5 won't hurt anything. The polarity is something that has the potential to hurt anything depending on how the circuit is built. So just be aware of that. Most of the manufacturers are pretty good about indicating what goes where. So you should be good on that. Decibel 11 is a jam. Yeah, they were big for a while, kind of earlier on. They're more of that linear analog style. I don't know if they've changed since then, but that's one consideration. Oh, here you go, Tim. Playing great, Tim, from Theo.
That's my boy.
Yeah,
That's my boy,
Theo. Why is it better to double the voltage at the pump? Does it mean that the second effect pedal will be affected by turning on the first effect? Well, if you're doubling the voltage, so going from 9 to 18, you would typically do that because you're going to be putting two in series. So you want to do that typically at the output section, going one into the next. So when I say doing it at the pump, that's what I mean. I'm just taking one of the outputs and going into the next output, putting those in series so I can go 9 plus 9 equals 18 down at the end of the pedal there. So that's just a good idea when you're doing it. But if you buy the pre-made voltage doublers, it kind of does all that stuff for you, so you don't have to worry about trying to figure out how to wire up a custom-made cable to do it. And some of them just have a pigtail at the end, so you can still adjust your cable length at the end if you wanted to re-terminate and solder it like we do in our videos. Yeah, so Brad, some people have this. So apparently Truetone has said that as long as you don't exceed the 3 amp maximum of the CS12, that you can actually use any one output to do it. I wasn't aware that that was an option because it doesn't say that in the instructional manuals that I've read on them, and this could have been old information when they first came out. But my understanding is that you actually can use a single one, and then it will just sort of redistribute the power accordingly. So you don't actually have to follow the exact guidelines of the outputs if it gives you a milliamp maximum, as long as you don't exceed that 3 amp total on the supply. So I have heard this, and I've seen some videos of them showing that, but I'm actually going to be visiting them in a week or so in Nashville. So I will get the true rundown of the do's and don'ts on that particular power supply. So I can tell you more about that then. I actually haven't powered an HX Stomp with one of them. The ones I've done rigs for have all been with the Zuma. So I haven't actually tried it with their particular supply. I have a Joyo battery pack. I don't know what that is. We'll have to look that up. Let's do a couple more and let's go to a Klon clone. Let's see. Do you know of a power supply that can do 12 volt AC at 1 amp? Yes, Cioks makes one that can do that. I don't remember the name of it, but they do have one because I had to do my Hughes and Kettner Rotosphere is 12 volts at 1 amp AC. So I know that they work with that. Have you noticed a difference in overdrive noise between different power units? Yeah, if you're using like a wall wart that's a switch, because a lot of those switching supplies are actually wall warts, but they just don't make them very well, and they choose frequencies that are in the audio range, so you can have some issues there. But typically, if it's a good quality isolated supply, no, there's not much difference between one and another. At least none that I've experienced in any significant way. Let's go to some Klon clones. We're gonna try the Archer. This is the Gold Archer, which is one of my favorites, and let's see how this does. Let's see what Tim thinks. All right, let's do the same. Let's go low gain. Let's try that. All right, go for it, Tim. Sounds like my wife's home.
I'm not getting any signal.
No. Nothing? Are we backwards? Oh. Haha. We're backwards. How about now? Hey, Zeke. Yeah? Signal?
Yeah.
All right. A little more gain.
Yeah, so that's pretty clean.
So it sounds more like the polished one.
Is this?
That's the output. Oh, wait, is that gain? No, it's gain.
So that's all the way up. Oh, that's almost all the So yeah, that's all the way up. But yeah.
So of the three, we have Klon 1, Klon 2, Clone. How do you feel like it's stacked up?
They all sound really good. I've actually used this one on gigs before, but yeah, I really like it. I like that style of pedal. I think this one,
The horse one,
this is the holy grail.
the Morley,
The Steve Vai signature model.
Steve Vai signature Klon, right?
Yeah.
All right, we'll just send you home with that one.
Immediately going on reverb.
No, I think we devalued it because I ripped off the sticker with dual lock Velcro on the bottom and all that.
Big mistake.
Yeah, big mistake. Worth half the value now. All right, let's see. All right, this is Joseph Ladd. Mason, can you comment on the differences of powering pedals, i.e. overdrive, VCA, compressor, that operate at both 9 versus 18? How does the voltage difference affect the tone and performance? Well, typically if you're going up to 18 volts, it's adding more headroom. So it's basically saying it's going to stay cleaner longer before you get more of the effect. So if it's an overdrive, it's going to stay cleaner longer before it might distort or clip. And in a compressor sense, it may not trigger the compression as early as you would want it. I usually don't find it to be a benefit unless it was designed to actually be 18 volts on the input because it requires that much power to operate the product. Because it just seems like it takes you longer to get the effect. And if you're buying the effect for that particular purpose, then don't you want it to trigger what the coloration is that it's supposed to be earlier on? So that's been my attitude. But, you know, there are conditions like with our steel string, our original steel string MK1 at 18 volts, it had a little bit more headroom, and guys like that when they went into small combo amps because the combo amps tend to be a lot more bass heavy, a little boxier sounding, and by having a really, really big, fat, kind of low end sound, affected that a lot. So by increasing the headroom, it didn't get there quite as quick, and it allowed them a little bit more flexibility. So there could be a condition like that where you may want to have the 18 volts instead of the 9. But typically, I prefer the stuff at whatever the design voltage was, the lower of the two.
Do you run the new one at 18? Or is it
The new one actually already has that, and then it has the bass cut switch in it, which is an added feature. So you can kind of get there either way.
So you don't run it at 18?
No. But if you put 18 volts into it, it'll accept it. It just won't do anything. It just regulates it down to 9. So it won't really help anything. Is 9 volt for drives all hype? Again, like I was saying, I don't think it. I think it is hype. I don't think it increases the headroom. It also increases the noise, which is another thing that some people may not consider when you're running at 18 volts. You have more of a noise floor at 18 volts. But I don't think it gives you the effect in the way that it's intended, in a lot of cases. And I remember when those exotic DC converter in a box, stepped everything up 9 to 18. Everybody was putting them in everything, and people were blowing up pedals all the time. Like, a lot of pedals are not made to take 18 volts. So just because it works on one thing, it's not like it's going to work on everything. It'd be like saying, I got a size 12 shoe, so I guess you must have a size 12 too, right? It's like that presumption is not legitimate in this circumstance. Anus repairman. Anus. Maybe it's anus. In the MXR M238 ISO brick 10 versus the one spot CS12, does the MXR having an 18 volt power input to the power supply affect the isolation? They're just doing it in a different way, because I think that they have like an outboard piece that's bringing in the voltage from the wall, and then it's pushing it to 18 volts so it's doing a similar thing to the one spot. It's just moving components of the switching supply outside of the supply to then bring it in, is what I recall. So they're just going about it a different way, but I believe that's also a switching supply, if that's the model that I'm thinking of. They're just kind of achieving it in a slightly different way. And some of the Strymon pedals do a similar thing, like the Ojai does it in a similar way, or one of the versions of the Ojai. I forget kind of all the different versions that they have. This is JJE, just jumped in. What do you think about the Pedal Train Volto rechargeable power supply? Is it better to have one plugged in? It's better to have one plugged in. I wouldn't recommend that over an isolated power supply. Smaller boost in the works, not at this time. The thing that people have to realize about the boost, Tim, can you grab one for me? Right there. Is that these jacks on the back have a finite size. So the wall of the jacks go all the way to the edge internally. So it's not like this is just a cylinder that goes straight back. There's actually a body of the jack. So this is actually pretty much going edge to edge on this thing. So the only way to make this smaller is if I took one of these jacks and moved it to the side. But then the savings that you would get by making it smaller, if you were going to use the expression jack, you'd have to then add in the width of that jack going out to your expression pedal, and then you would be pretty close back to this supply or this enclosure size, even though visually it would look smaller. So that's the only way to do it if you want to still maintain the expression jack. Now, if the expression jack is not important to most people, then there could be a consideration argument to eliminate it altogether. So at this point, I don't know how we could do that, and we would also lose the battery inside the pedal, and that also may not be critical for you, but that's why. That's why it's not smaller. Jacob Peterson, what's up, Mason? Great episode. What's your take on the Strymon versus One Spot Pro? I've heard the Strymon is quieter with some effects, but I'm not sure. Is the build quality better? This is a good question. Thanks, Jacob. And if you don't know Jacob, he's one of my favorite guitar players. He lives out in Austin. You should definitely check him out. Amazing player. Great tone. So the Strymon, the thing I've found that I've had an issue with is these screws, if you were to unscrew them, they're like barely a quarter of an inch. I mean, like maybe a half an inch max. I don't even think they're half. I think they're a quarter of an inch. So a lot of times with vibration on the road, what ends up happening is I've had these tops just come off. So like, for example, I went did some rigs with Corey Wong, and I went and serviced his old rig when he was at the Troubadour in LA, and this piece was just rattling around inside of the like I built him like kind of a custom bridge that fit over this thing, and this was just like rattling around the bridge, and there was like screws that were just like kind of like soup inside this thing, so it sounded like a rain stick when you'd move it like this. And it's not the only time that I've had this issue with the supply. Electrically, this supply is rock solid. It couldn't be better built. It's very, very, very well built electrically. Mechanically, I think that the Truetone is a better built supply. It's more robust, it's heavier duty, it definitely can take more of a beating. Now, I have seen some of the specs from another manufacturer, who I'm not going to say, that showed me kind of where the high frequency is in the Truetone versus theirs versus the Strymon. And the Truetone one was slightly in the audio range, which means that in certain circumstances you may be able to hear some high frequency oscillation out of the Truetone one. I haven't heard that myself in any of the rigs that I've built, so that could mean that however the system is that I've set up, or the pedals that we use, haven't exhibited a sensitivity to that where we can hear that high frequency, or maybe it's just that my hearing is shot and I don't hear over 10K, or I don't know. But I haven't heard it, but I could see that there was clearly evidence that happened. I think in the majority of circumstances, it probably wouldn't be audible. There may be some conditions where that would be audible, that wouldn't be, say, in the Truetone or the Cioks or some of the other manufacturers that make switching supplies. So, that's sort of the trade-off. One thing that I do now with these when I get them is I extend the length of these screws, so I use longer screws here. And try to make it as robust as I can, just using better quality washers, better quality nuts, locking washers with teeth in them and stuff like that, to try to increase the durability so that it won't just shake loose from rattling, because it is really lightweight, but the cost of that is that it has a little less robustness as a result. So I think that they can both be great. I don't think that I would discourage you from getting one over the other. I think that they both have their strengths. Right. Cioks. I think I said it that way a few times. Maybe I went back and forth. Anderson. Hey, Mason. Which reverb do you prefer? The Source Audio True Spring, not the Strymon Flint. I prefer the Source Audio. I like the way that they do their ADA conversions. For me, whenever I turn the mix off on the Strymon to totally dry, and you turn it on and off, it seems to impart some sort of cleanliness to the signal that I don't like. So I don't have anything against Strymon. I think that they're groundbreaking. They've done some great stuff. I just don't use them personally for that reason. I don't like that artifact. Let's take a couple more, and then we'll go into some more guitar playing. This is from Foundation Rock Inns. How can I route my Mesa Boogie dual buffer into the HX effects loops to compensate for any tone loss from my amp? So guitar would go into the Mesa Boogie buffer input. Send would go into the input of your HX effects, if that's the only effect you're using, it sounds like. Out of the HX effects would go into the return of the dual buffer from Mesa, and then out into your amplifier. That would be how to do it. Music Therapy Laz, what are your thoughts about the Fiat?
Flat.
Oh. Yeah, I was like, Fiat's making patch cables? Flat patch cables like the EBS Pros. Well, I took one apart at Sweetwater, and they are in fact soldered, so that's great. But I don't like the sound of them compared to like a Mogami or a Belden or a Canary patch cable. So they're really flat. It's difficult to dress them nicely if you're going to do like long runs or a switcher or something like that. I just don't like the way that they sound, so I just took like a bunch of them and put them in series in a switcher, and then just turned on all the loops. And because there weren't any that were really long enough individually for me to really assess how they sounded, I just didn't like how they sounded. But that's just a personal preference. It doesn't mean that they're bad. But I think that as far as the build, they're fine. What small pedals are in the works? I just bought the bigger steel string when the smaller one came out. Oh man, I'm sorry. Well, I'll tell you what, if you email us, I'll give you a bro deal on the small if you want one. I have a couple of other ones. I think we're going to be more focusing on releasing a few new pedals this year, and maybe only converting over one other small one. I'm not sure yet which one that's going to be. Let's do one more. How do you route effects in the ES5 loops that are in the amp effects loop. So they give a diagram in their literature that shows how to do it. I think you have to sacrifice a loop. So you like take the send out of loop 4, for example, and then you return it into loop 5. So you sacrifice a loop in order to do that. So you have to basically use 2 loops to occupy 1. But if it's a MIDI controlled thing, then you don't have to sacrifice any loops because you can do all the program changes and on and off through MIDI, and you can have it exist outside of the switcher. So there you go. Jesse Davies' new Vibe 1968 into the 18-volt Strymon Zuma killer pedal. Though he nailed it for sure. I've heard it's good. I haven't tried it yet. But he makes great pedals, so I'm sure that it's cool. Let's see. I think we've covered most of the questions here. If there's any that I've missed, Mason, any I've missed?
I don't think so.
All right, let's play a little bit more and then let's end this thing. What should we go back to, Tim? I mean, you played a bunch of the. You want to go back to the horse
Yeah, try this one.
output, input, 9 volts. All right. Getting back on the horse. Set the gain. So is that one still the best?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's I think that's cool. Like, it's like it has this cool like fat boostness to it, and then you can also sort of get the kind of tube screamer-ish, but like more hi-fi almost. So that's cool.
Nice. All right.
Sounds fantastic.
All right. We got a couple last ones here. Gabe. Where's it? Gabe. Thinking about building a bass pedal board. What power supply can you recommend that has 18 volts output for the Aguilar tone hammer? I think the CS12, this guy right here, will do it. It's got AC all the way there on the right, and then it's got 12 and 18 volt options. That should do it for you. And equally, Davey Dahl, DL4 and a whammy, same thing, CS12 right there. And oh yeah, Greg. Greg's the best. Shout out to Greg at Sweetwater. If you want any of these products, you can just hit up Greg and he can help you out. And Dan of New Jersey. I have a question. Do you find that sharing power from a 9-volt 400 isolated power supply does create noise? It's more dependent on the pedal than the power supply. So if the pedals are under that milliamps, in terms of the collective between the ones that are sharing, and that they're, analog, distortion, overdrive type devices, you typically won't have a problem. Again, I don't try to exceed maybe 2 or 3 sharing power, 2 if possible, 3 at max, and that's kind of the way to go. If you need to, but obviously if you can have your own output for each one, it's preferable. But if you need to fudge it a little bit, that is workable. You would need to get something like, let's see, one of the parallel, something like this will work for that. Although this one is not the right one. You want to get the one where it has a longer, one side that's longer than the other, so you can go to the adjoining pedal. Let's see, Chad, running a small bass pedal board, do I need buffer in and out at that size? Yes, because still the primary capacitance is still going to be the cable going back to your amplifier, the input cable. Those lengths probably don't change irrespective of the number of pedals you have. The interconnections on pedal board are relatively short, 6 inches, foot, 2 feet maybe, but your long leads are, going back to your amp, that could be 15 feet, going into your guitar pedal board, maybe 10 feet, or your bass pedal board, 10, 15 feet. So absolutely yes, and a dual buffer preferably. By the way, any pedal board with 12 volt, 500 milliamp outputs, yeah, I think you can do it out of this guy right here. You can set, let's see, 12 volts. Yeah, so 12 volts on the CS7, you can set all these to 12, and there's 7 of them, and they'll all do 12 volts. So DC7, that'll do it from Cioks. What do you think of Tech 21 pedals? Some of them are really cool. I like the AC30 kind of one that they did. I think that was a really cool one. Some of their stuff's great. Off subject, I missed the last live stream. What's your opinion of the built-in buffer on the TC Electronics Ditto 4X? I don't know the specs on it. I gave kind of a checklist for what those specs need to be. So somewhere around 80 to 150 output impedance and 1 meg input impedance. But that would just be your output section. You still need an input buffer. So you need to have one at the beginning, one at the end. Even if that buffer is fantastic, presumably it would be at the end if it's a looper. I think that's going to wrap us for today. Now, Tim, if they want to go and follow you on the socialist medias, where do they do that?
On Instagram and on YouTube, Tim Marco. You can find me. And I'm going to be dropping an original song in about a month. And it's actually sort of the intro song that you hear on some of the Vertex videos.
Yeah.
So look out for that one. It's called 98. And
Because were you born in 1998?
No. It's a song I wrote about my 98 Subaru.
Oh.
My white Subaru. And just reminiscing about the days in the 90s.
Driving to prom in the 98 Subaru.
Not quite, but
it was your dad's F-150.
I don't know.
Good times.
Good
times. Well, we'll continue to feature it when it's out. But if you've watched any of our videos, Tim has scored a lot of the really funky stuff. That's Tim in the background there that we featured So we'll definitely have you back on again, Tim, and get the word out about that. 'Cause Tim is an excellent musician, one of my favorites. Yeah. Oh, and there it is in the chat. So you can definitely go check out Tim. Amazing musician, lots of tone. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, that you like. Even if you just put a like to this video, that helps us out quite a bit. Helps us just get better optimization in YouTube. If you can leave a comment, about maybe what your favorite part was of today or anything you learned, we'd love to hear your feedback. We're also getting t-shirts in the works with Teespring, so you'll actually be able to purchase Vertex merch every time we put out a video. But we don't want to just put out a meaningless t-shirt that just says like Vertex. Maybe that's cool, but we want to get something that people actually want to wear. So is there anything, I don't know, that I do or that I say that's ridiculous that you think would be worthy of a t-shirt? I don't know. So let us know what that is. And we will, we can make any type of t-shirt with Teespring. Basically, they actually create the t-shirt and they fulfill it. And then they just give us like a dividend off of everyone they sell. So we can create as many designs as possible. It can be weird stuff, funny stuff, whatever you think is going to be cool. So put that in the comments. We'd love to hear from you about that. And thank you so much for your participation today and being with us for this hour and a half. So until next time, see you later. Make sure you follow Tim. Thank you, Mejia. All right.